Hello, dear listeners. So today I'm with Nativist Concern, and yes, I'm talking to an Englishman. But don't worry, this is not a betrayal of my principles, because what we're going to do is going to talk about the Anglo's biggest hobby, finance. So, hello, Nativist. Welcome.
Hi, Faust. Good to be speaking to you again. I will add before we get into the depths of this depraved system that one of the biggest players was the eternal Dutchman Franklin D. Roosevelt in setting up this American hegemony, which we now live under. But I'm looking forward to exploring it and giving some insight into the real power in the world. How the financial system works, how it interacts with our civilization, and how we interact with other civilizations. Because I think finance is a topic that's really been lacking in the nationalist,
Yeah.
distant right, and I hope this will become a reference piece for people that need to understand more about the real power in the world.
Yeah, so it's not necessarily that we're going to explain. Well, we might explain things, but we're not going to sort of offer a solution to everything because that's beyond the remit of just two people. It's an entire field into itself on how to solve all these things. But it's good to help people get a better understanding of how our monetary system works, how international trade works, and central banking and so on. And I think I should mention we met through TASOP, which is your podcast, together with some other Brits.
Yeah, we're free Englishmen. We decided 18 months ago that we needed to red pill the community at large into gaining the truth into how the system works against them and how it is replacing our ethnos. And since then, we've grown and grown. We've got quite a big international following all around Europe and the Anglosphere. So we're quite pan-white. We're not, petty nationalists. We're not English nationalists. We're more sort of European civilization nationalist. And it's more about education and having a laugh along the way. And hopefully we don't get arrested for it.
Well, I'm pettily anti-English, so that doesn't go with it very well, does it?
You're just jealous because we did what you did, but better.
Yeah, I guess kind of, but with the wrong values also, with your liberalism. Right. I think the first thing to talk about is the petrodollar system. So, petrodollar system, you hear about it all the time, used to be a big leftist talking point. It is actually a thing. After Bretton Woods was the economic consensus model after the Second World War, which was based on the US dollar and gold. In 1970, Nixon decoupled the dollar from the gold standard, and since then we've had this new model called the petrodollar system, in which internationally oil is traded in dollars, and basically energy security is the backing of the dollar, and the US military system makes sure the dollar holds its value and makes sure people trade oil in dollars. Now, there are some facets to that. For example, one aspect that is often ignored is that in this deal they have with primarily Saudi Arabia, there's also a right of first purchase on gold by Saudis. So one of the things to understand is that our money is just paper promises. It doesn't hold any inherent value. And if you actually look at what wealthy people do in this world, they do not hold their wealth in fiat. They hold it in bonds, shares, gold, etc.
Yeah, it was 1970 that it decoupled. That was partly to do with the pressure of public spending programs, the Korean War, Vietnam War. It was Nixon that did it. Obviously, he's a puppet for higher powers, but there we are. And it was in 1974 that the deal between the USA and Saudi Arabia was made, that agreed that all oil purchases would be in dollars, and the reserves generated would be channeled through the North American financial system. And the same applies today to the pound sterling. We get petro pound from Qatar and UAE and all these Gulf states.
Yeah.
And now we're in a situation where 60% of all the foreign currency reserves in the world are held in dollars. I think it's about $1.8 trillion in circulation around the world, and more than half of that is outside the USA.
Yeah, which means that the biggest export product of the US is debt.
And it gives the US an enormous amount of power. International debt is denominated in dollars, oil's denominated in dollars, gold's denominated in dollars, and some countries even use dollars as directly as currency because their
Zimbabwe,
own system.
Venezuela, because their own currencies are just worthless.
Yeah, even places like Lebanon now. It really happens all over the world. And yeah, Saudi Arabia is a very significant player in world politics, not only because it's the religious center of Islam, but also it has the lowest extraction cost in the world per barrel of oil. Yeah. It's only $8 to extract it. So they can flood the market of oil, $15 oil if they like. They could put other economies under immense pressure.
It's what they've been doing since this COVID thing. The COVID, some people might remember there was a short squeeze on oil back in May, where oil went negative for a bit. Well, not actually, but oil contracts went negative for a bit. And what's been happening is that the Saudis have been in a price war because they basically want US shale off the market. And US shale is very expensive relative to any other form of oil. In actual fact, it shouldn't even be competitive on the market, but there's these financial constructs where US dollars and bonds are used to support the price. So the Fed's involved in keeping it's all geostrategical in that sense. The Fed's involved in keeping US shale oil on the market so the US can be energy independent while not bankrupting itself.
I think the extraction cost of shale is about $40 a barrel. So they need it.
I only know the energy investment returns. So energy investment returns of 1 barrel of oil is about 8 barrels back in shale oil, but about 20 to 25 in Saudi Arabia. So in terms of energy prices, it's very unviable.
But overall, rather than being in opposition, often Saudi will act on the instructions of the US government. For example, in the Ukrainian color revolution a few years ago, under Obama's administration, the oil price was smashed down to $25 then, and it put Russia under immense pressure, and it also sparked the collapse of Venezuela.
Yes.
And the US tried to coup Venezuela not so long ago.
Which was all about oil. That was all. Venezuela has relatively large oil reserves, and it's all about energy security.
It would give America an extra option to leverage against China, because China does a huge amount of business with Venezuela. Yeah. And as you say, Venezuela has the largest reserves. It's all about oil, as many of these puppet governments that get overthrown and invaded are about.
The wars in Syria, Libya, and Iraq are all about the strategic dominance over oil by the US. And that's one of the reasons that they really want to attack Iran, is because Iran is also a major provider of oil to China. And if China has no independent source of oil, that makes them very geostrategically weak.
Yeah, I mean, there's this coalescing with Zionist ambitions. Because the strange thing is now that the US is in a position where it can be energy independent. There are all these different interests, and the American empire depends on the petrodollar ultimately. So it is going to want to keep hegemony in the Middle Eastern region regardless. Because if China starts, getting its claws into the Middle East and starts trading petrol, starts trading oil in yuan, then it undermines the whole petrodollar system, which could become an existential risk for the US.
Or trading oil for gold, which is what Gaddafi proposed doing, which is really just cutting out the dollar middleman, because most of what the Saudis do with a lot of their fiat dollars is just buy gold because they have the right of first purchase, or they use the money because they have so much money that they can't really do anything with it anymore. The country is as developed, as high tech as you're going to get. It has the most high tech cities on some levels because, for example, Dubai does not actually have sewers. They use sewer trucks for everything. So on some levels it's very developed, on some it's not. But it's very high tech generally. So they have so much money that they have only the option to put it in something that holds its value, which is gold, or fund geopolitical project with it, such as, they fund mosques all over the world.
There is this plan to float Aramco and raise all this capital and then turn Saudi Arabia and have sort of holiday resorts and casinos and all this sort of stuff. I have heard of that sort of plan and the involvement of big players like Richard Branson. But that remains to be seen whether they actually pull it off. The Gulf state UAE has already done the same, and it's sort of a long-term plan for the leadership so that they'll last into the future. Because we're facing a situation now where we don't know exactly how much oil there is left, and it may only last another 50 years or so.
Yeah, which is, I think, in part why they talk about things like this Green New Deal and the energy transition, which I think is necessary. But the thing is, electricity is not a full replacement for hydrocarbons. I'm actually writing an article about this for a Dutch publication, but you can't transport electricity as easily as hydrocarbons, and it doesn't generate as much energy relative to its volume. So heavy machinery, planes, you can't really do that with electricity. Big ships. So it would be a fundamental restructuring of the economy if we reach peak oil. It would require it, which is why I think they're talking about it now while we still have some time.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the Green New Deal seems to be quite corrupt. I mean, you get these cobalt miners and lithium miners bribing the sort of lefty political establishment into shilling environmentalism to the Western voting population.
Yeah, sure. There's a lot of like backdoor dealing, profiteering, and so on. But the general idea, I think, is to go electrical for most things as a way to deal with the fallout from peak oil.
Well, I think the elephant in the room is depopulation. It's the thing that no one wants to talk about. But the only way humanity survives after peak oil is a massively lower population. I think we could live off renewables so long as the population is lower and our energy demands are lower.
It's perfectly possible to create enough energy with nuclear. The big things that would fall away are transportation related. So automobiles would be gone. Major shipping would be impossible. You have to go back to either really expensive nuclear powered ships or sailing. But personal transportation would be gone and flying would be out of it because there's no way to generate enough electricity aboard a plane. You can't put a nuclear reactor on a plane. So flying's out the window. So you're going to have to scale back your logistics because otherwise you run into problems with, if all your production is in China, how the hell are you going to get it here without shipping?
Is it not possible to have hydrogen powered planes or something like that?
Oh, you could make Zeppelins, but Zeppelins are quite a lot slower. Like it takes 3 days for a transatlantic flight with a Zeppelin. I've got a video about Zeppelins, actually. I'll put it in the description.
How very Germanic of you.
Absolutely.
These questions remain to be answered well into the future. But the power centers in the world at the moment, obviously the United States of America, the Eurozone is sort of hoping to become a rival in some ways, but also a submissive partner of the USA and in many others.
Yeah, the EU seems quite comfortable as a junior partner of the American empire.
Yeah, exactly. I really resent its sort of laid back and liberal attitude to Europe, which I consider to be the premium continent civilization that's ever been and ever will be.
Of course we are.
20% of the global currency reserves are kept in euros at the moment. I'm sure it'd be more if the European leadership was more competent. And the yuan has ambitions to become a reserve currency of its own.
Did you know that our banks, all our central banks in Europe, have a deal where they maintain about 20% of their GDP in gold as reserves. And this deal has been on since the creation, about even 10 years before the creation of the euro, which means that in a way the euro is sort of backed by gold. And if we ever were to have to deal with a fallout from the dollar going maximally inflational or other issues with it, we can just declare that our euro is backed by gold. This is one thing where populists can be very dangerous because they are economically illiterate. Because what Salvini did when he had power is he sold off massive amounts of the Italian gold reserves, which is a stupid thing to do, but he does to basically buy votes so he can keep the pensions and so on high.
I didn't actually know that, but it's funny you mentioned Salvini, because I was going to say that you've sort of got the American Zionist lobby has supported Brexit. They've supported Salvini, and now their big thing is pumping up the anti-China rhetoric. So they're a big sort of behind the scenes, American hegemony, American petrodollar vibes behind that.
There's not a populist movement in Europe that isn't also Zionist, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I'm very concerned about Italy pulling out of the Eurozone, because as much as I want reform in the European political sphere, I don't want it to collapse in a heap and then be divided up by the American empire and, whoever else.
Well, I don't think the EU is reformable. It's built in a way to keep people like us out, and it's a currency union with the entirety of Europe will never work because of the differences between our national economies. And the EU doesn't really seem at all willing to do anything about Chinese subversion, for example. The Chinese control all our major steel industries in Europe. They control a lot of the power companies in several countries, telecom companies. They're buying up everything. And if it isn't the Chinese, it's the Saudis.
Yeah, I mean, the whole European leadership structure is so lazy. It's just, so half-baked. I mean, they will protect industries like agriculture, solar panels, aerospace.
Which is just because of the French. The French keep lobbying for agriculture.
I mean, the French and their working habits have a big influence on that, I'm sure. I mean, I don't know how much value there would be in protecting the steel industry. I mean, it's the environmental taxes that really screw the whole European competitiveness, isn't it?
Yeah, but by that same token, you could say, well, we're really screwing our competitiveness by having all these child labor laws. I mean, sure, you can be more competitive, but if you do things like China, like having 8-year-olds work, but I mean, is that really what you want to do? I think environmental standards aren't really that bad an idea.
Well, as I understand it, there are a lot of green taxes that are not very useful at all. I mean, we're in the habit of burning renewable wood pellets instead of coal and garbage like that.
It's a big scandal in the Netherlands right now, where a lot of our energy targets were to go 20% renewables by, I think, 2025. And one of the things that they had done was they reconstructed coal power plants to burn biofuel. And the idea was originally that biofuel would be like agricultural leftovers and so on. But instead what they're doing is they're chopping down entire forests in America and in the Baltic states, shipping all that wood over here, burning it, and then saying it's green energy. Yeah,
exactly. There was a documentary on YouTube recently about that, called something like Planet of the Humans,
by
maybe
Michael
something
Moore,
like that.
I think it was.
Yeah, it was very surprising, because Moore came off as a complete incompetent shill after the Trump election, but then he actually did something, truly progressive, exposing this scam from these elites that posed as lefties. And I just feel this is a repeated pattern of behaviour from these sorts of people. People that pose as lefties, but they're nothing more than selfish shills that are looking to expand their personal wealth.
Yeah, as I often say, economically everything's neoliberal. The leftists are allowed to run rampant in culture and social terms, but as soon as they get near the economy, they get shut down immediately.
Yeah, exactly. It's their, if they speak too much about welfare programs, to the point of harming the superstructure or the capitalist profits, then they'll shut down on the leftist parties. If the leftist parties are pushing for deregulation of immigration or other issues that benefit the same superstructure, then they'll put them in power.
Yeah, exactly. Whenever it works in favor of the system, it's fine. Then you can say whatever.
So yeah, in terms of China's sort of push for hegemony, their second largest economy in the world and the largest exporter in the world.
Which we've
And
kind of
thereby
allowed to happen, right?
Yeah, we could have shut them down in many more ways than we have so far. I mean, they're by far the biggest importer of oil in the world, and in 2017 they agreed with Russia. This was a pivotal moment. They agreed with Russia that purchases could be made in yuan. They've echoed the same agreement with Iran, Angola, and Venezuela. And now there are even oil futures contracts on the Shanghai exchange that are backed by gold, and it gives these smaller countries some respite against the U.S. sanctions. We've already mentioned the Iranian and Venezuelan interference by the USA, but I could well see Angola being subjected to some sort of operation by the Western powers.
Well, one thing we're really not doing is we're letting China take control over Africa. And Africa is just one of the major reserves of strategic resources in the world. And we're just letting them do it.
I mean, they've got a huge stranglehold in East Africa and South Africa. It's hard to tell how much the Western powers actually have power there. How many puppet governments are controlled by the CIA and whether other governments can be tipped at any moment.
France is still very active in its former colonies in the Cape and in Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana. They're very active there. They've got constant military presence on the ground. Mali.
Ghana was British, I believe.
Okay, well, then you've lost it to the French.
Senegal, maybe.
Senegal, too. I think Mali is the biggest one at the moment because there's this big anti-terrorism operation because of the jihadist movement there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the jihadist attack in even Mozambique recently. The Islam is massively on the rise in Africa, Islamic militant movements, and you've also got massive French and American military presence.
Yep.
I believe there are up to 2 million Chinese citizens now living in Africa. We know the way China operates in Africa. They issue big loans. They will pump money into.
They just do what the US does, except they don't have the IMF to make it appear more legitimate.
Yeah, that's a good way of describing it. Actually.
Have you ever read the book Confessions of an Economic Hitman?
I've not.
It's a leftist book, but it describes very well. It's from a former IMF worker, and he basically describes how he would, for IMF, but also for the CIA and so on, go to countries like Peru and basically make them debt slaves to the U.S. system, making sure that they cannot operate independently. So they would get loans for improving their infrastructure, for example. But in the deal would be that they had to hire American companies to do it, which meant the money just flowed back right into the American economy. The infrastructure is now built, but none of the locals earned any money. The economy of Peru didn't really grow except for the built infrastructure. No one gained any experience or expertise in this field, and the construction workers are gone afterwards. And you still have this loan to pay back.
Exactly, and the sort of loans are paid for by the Western taxpayer, and then the profits are privatized by the Western corporations.
Yeah.
It was very recently that Bolivia had a coup d'etat of sorts, and Elon Musk bragged about it when questioned on Twitter, and that was to do with the lithium, the lithium reserves in sort of that part of South America, which will be ultimately flowing into the Tesla establishment, as it were. I mean, China is chipping away, sort of denominating oil trades in their own currency, backing it with gold and such. And the American empire is lashing out. We've had all these U-turns in allowing Chinese industry into the UK recently, I believe elsewhere in Europe as well. Just recently, a couple of weeks ago, TikTok was forced to sell to Microsoft. Yeah,
they were forced because the US said TikTok would not be allowed in their country, so they had to shift owners so that could operate in the US.
Trump announced it on the sort of Friday night or Saturday or something, and on Monday morning, Microsoft was up 7%. It was based intellectual property theft, but the other way. And the Americans are normally moaning about the Chinese doing it by hacking, but they did it through the power they have over the consumer.
Yeah, they always talk about this. Like there was a scandal like a few months ago, 8 months ago or so. There was a scandal here in the Netherlands that Iran had supposedly stolen intellectual property from our universities. But the things they alleged were that they were stealing stuff like textbook information, which is all available on the internet. It's the most ridiculous accusation.
Yeah, they're going to smear Iran in any way that they can, aren't they? I mean, there are sort of geopolitical moves happening in the EU now. So, we're seeing the full integration of the EU empire. We've got this fake colour revolution in Belarus. That's going on there. We had Israeli, British and American agents caught trying to incite riots in Serbia recently. We had attacks on the Orthodox Church that sort of aligned with Serbia recently. So, the NATO sphere of influence is expanding under the rainbow flag, and they will attempt to shut China out of
That's
all
a good
these
expression,
markets.
marching under the rainbow flag.
The cheaper textiles production and whatever, they'll probably attempt to move to India because India has an exploding population, infinite $1 a day labor, and India speaks English. It's well aligned with the Anglo Empire.
Oh yeah, and
so
they're really on board with a lot of this. Like just before the Corona stuff, there were massive race riots in India because of they basically took away the citizenship of Muslims in India. You're no longer that was especially in Delhi, wasn't it? Unbelievable scenes. They were just burning all the Muslim property, climbing up the mosques and ripping off the crescent moon off the minarets and all sorts. Of American empire is going to be selling India a lot of military industrial gear over the next decade, lining them up to take over aspects of industry, and generally, turning their economy neoliberal. Because I think India is going to be the new China. It's more favorable to the US. It's more friendly. It has enough workers. China also has a problem that it now has a middle class of several 100 million people who want better living standards and better salaries, which means that production costs increase. So they're just going to shift a lot of it to India, I think.
The thing about Indians is they're very subservient to the Anglo. I think that suits the Anglo imperial class. They can probably get away with India than they ever would have got away with in China.
You're aware that it's no longer your colony,
its own
right?
ambitions. Well, a lot of Indians I meet, they sort of run as if they're looking for instructions. It's quite bizarre, actually. I think it must have something to do with the Aryan invasion all those millennia ago.
Does it maybe relate to the fact that you're wearing a pith helmet and a monocle, or?
I think it's probably to do with the caste system and the racial aspects of that. I think they must have internalized it in some way. But they certainly don't seem as vicious in lust for revenge as the Chinese do. The Chinese were rather embarrassed and harmed by the Franco-Anglo empire of the mid-19th century, which resulted in mass opium addiction and burning of their.
But China is also a more
relics.
Coherent culture. I mean, it's almost one ethnicity. It has a 3,500 year history as one coherent nation. India wasn't united until the British united it, and even then, it still had a lot of subdivisions and protectorates within it.
Yeah, it comes back to race again, doesn't it? China is absolutely dominated by the Han Chinese, a specific ethnic group. And India has many different tribes, many different languages, and many different castes. So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. I expect India will become a big talking point in the next couple of decades. I think the sort of Western economies will be importing all their best people. on H-1B visas in America,
it's already
to work in the tech firms. And yeah, it's already happening, and it will continue to happen. The UK shows no signs of slowing down their importation of elite Indians to work for not very much in the corporations.
Isn't that what your nationalist supposedly parties advocate for, with Nigel Farage and so on? We won't be taking all of these Muslim refugees, but we'll be importing from the Commonwealth, meaning India.
Well, Pakistan is in the Commonwealth, but yeah, it's sort of, it links up with Zionism again. It's like anti-Islam, these nice immigrants from Hong Kong and India. So yeah, there's that. And going back to the petrodollar and the Saudi issue, we've had bin Salman has sort of been flirting to the Eastern Empire fairly recently, and he had someone executed in the last 2 or 3 years after the CIA were attempting to coup bin Salman. So yeah, if Saudi Arabia were to accept yuan, that would be a huge shift in the balance of power.
Yeah, but then I think it's time to spread democracy to this backward Islamic monarchist nation for the US.
I mean, yeah. I mean, the battle for power in the Middle East and Africa, I do wonder what the West has in store for such an eventuality that it starts to look precarious for them. If Saudi Arabia was to try and flip, and other Gulf states or Shia rebels were to gain control of a lot of states in the region, then the US petrodollars are going to come under a lot of pressure. The same thing in Africa. If the CIA can't coup certain countries to their will, then they're going to need to send in the US Army, and we may even get a situation where we've Chinese army versus US NATO army on African soil. So yeah, that remains to be seen. I expect that both sides will probably carve it up, and there will be some sort of agreement to what they're allowed.
I don't think Africa will turn into a theater of battle, while the Middle East is still. It's too much of a commitment for the U.S. Not militarily, but in terms of the psychology of the population, they wouldn't want to deal with another eternal war in Africa.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough to predict. I don't know how much power the CIA and other for Africa. I don't know whether sort of African populations would have it in them to rebel against Chinese occupiers. And yeah, it's tough to sort of tell how that would interact. I was just going to say, if China want to sort of take over and have a petro currency of their own, they will need to give more legal security to foreign investors. If they were to become a serious reserve currency, they have the size to do it. It appears they have the will to do it. And the USA is a very strange place socially at the moment. They seem to be against nature itself. So maybe the balance of power will shift a lot quicker than history has shown so far.
But as I said with the example of India, with India becoming the new China, they'll try to make sure the economic power of China is destabilized by changing it to India. And at the same time, the EU keeps creeping up on Russia. And I wouldn't be surprised if at some point, especially if Putin dies, you've got a major problem in Russia. And there could also come a color revolution in Russia itself. The thing is, we are energy dependent in Europe on Russia. So we do have this difficult position where we have to follow the American interests by boycotting and sanctioning the Russians. But at the same time, we can't really do it because we have to import their oil and gas.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people miss this factor in sort of the geopolitics of the Middle East, and how it integrates with the Russian gas supply monopoly to Europe. That was probably the majority of the reason for Russian intervention into Syria, not just geopolitics and the clash between the West and the Eastern Empire. It was mostly to do with the gas hegemony, because the Anglo Empire is is wound up with the Qatar, and the Qataris invest a lot of their money into Western economy, and they have the biggest gas supply in the world, or something like that. Maybe
Russia.
second after Russia.
Could be.
The Qatar has a huge amount of gas for such a small country, and Assad blocked any sort of pipeline to Europe. So yeah.
The fact of the matter is that in
That's
the
the
Netherlands we are actually energy independent, because being a giant marsh means we're filled with gas underground. And for the last 70 years we've basically just used our own gas, which actually was a pretty poor decision, because with all the leftist governments, all that money was spent on welfare rather than actually something like the Norwegians with their sovereign wealth fund. But it's an exceptional position for us to be in. I think England, sorry, not England, but the British are relatively energy independent because of North Sea oil, but they still need imports.
Yeah, we do okay. I think we do something like 20% in renewables now. We've got North Sea oil. Our government is looking into nuclear. We should be completing a full nuclear plant soon, and also mini nuclear, which is another newer concept that the infamous Dominic Cummings, who's meant to be a fascist, but he's just a sort of liberal player in the Conservative Party. He's interested in investing in that. So I'm not too concerned about the UK energy-wise, but other countries in Europe could really do with gas supplies. I mean, Germany and Austria are demolishing nuclear power plants. It's totally crazy.
And instead, because of Fukushima, and what they're doing now is they're cutting down the oldest forests in Europe to mine the coal underneath it, and it's not even good quality coal; it's brown coal rather than. You've got different grades of coal. Brown coal is the most sort of it still has a lot of impurities in it, so it's very inefficient.
Yeah, it just seems like bad decision after bad decision from these governments. I mean, the French are looking at importing from Algeria their gas supply.
But the French do produce 60% of their electricity from nuclear.
Yeah. I mean, they're one of the biggest investors in nuclear. But I mean, you need gas for other things, don't you?
Yeah, that's the thing. Like what I was explaining with planes and ships, you can't really use electricity for transportation on that sort of scale, because you need to make a power grid. Like, you always have the problem that you need to be physically connected to the grid in one way or another.
I mean, how much uranium is there in the world? Is there enough to?
Oh, plenty. Yeah, no, there's enough uranium to. With our current energy demands, we could last thousands of years on the uranium reserves we have. We have enough uranium to take us into space and start mining asteroids, for example.
Okay, the lithium issue that will run out in a few decades, will it not?
Yeah, and electric cars really aren't that great a solution.
Yeah, I mean, I'm against electric cars.
Well,
to be honest, I can't believe the.
They're an in-between solution. They can work for some things, but the problem is you can't make enough cars. You can't make enough electric cars to replace all the cars in the world, and it doesn't really scale up. You can't build electric trucks, for example. It doesn't work. Not enough power.
I think they could get to that point.
Well, they could maybe
electric lorries.
But how are you going to, for example, like a three-phase motor, energy, like an electrical three-phase motor? There's no way to build one that generates enough power in any sort of scale to have, for example, an excavator or a bobcat. You'd need a gigantic motor to make that sort of power.
Well, maybe they'll come up with something. But yeah, I mean, I don't think they will need to replace every private transport vehicle in the world. I think the future is automation and short-term hire. I think that may even be the sort of the reason behind Tesla being having such a high valuation. I think it may be being lined up to have some sort of integration with Uber, and have an automated taxi service that's green energy and basically enforced as a monopoly.
I
Something
think
like that.
I think it's markets being rational and responding to incentives. Tesla is too big to fail. It gets all kinds of government subsidies, and green is in. So, of course, they're going to go for a company like Tesla, which is the face of energy-friendly, supposedly, transportation.
Yeah, I mean, they can get away with it running these huge huge debts and deficits. But yeah, I guess that brings us on to our next topic, really, the sort of post-COVID asset allocation and sort of big tech going through the roof and all these other changes in asset allocation. So what's been your sort of take on the last few months?
On the fact that we appear to have a stock market fueled entirely by central banking, you mean?
Well, that's been the case for over a decade, but just sort of the latest developments.
Yeah, it's kind of... I guess I kind of align with the zero hedge analysis on this, which is this system is broken, but they're kind of just stretching it to see where the breaking point is, because this can't logically last that long anymore, because with 40 million unemployed, but the stock market at the highest it's been, or almost the highest, I mean, that just is incongruous with one another. It just shows that the stock markets are not a reflection of the real economy.
Yeah, I mean, since 2008, we've just had a central bank-led economy, and all the asset classes just respond to the central banks. I was trading in the City of London 2010 to 2013, and I saw it all firsthand. The markets would only move in relation to central bank policy, really. I mean,
I'm in the market. I haven't seen a quarterly report or a dividend due date coming up influencing the market price of a stock almost at all. It doesn't seem to matter anymore.
Even the sovereign downgrades don't matter. You'll get one of the major rating agencies downgrading bonds, and they'll be up 2% the next day. It's all central bank led. I mean, in terms of COVID, we had what did the Federal Reserve print? Something like $8 trillion.
7 trillion, I think, but it wasn't all monetized into debt just yet. It's still on the books, it's on their balance sheet.
So BlackRock, run by Larry Fink, they were sort of given the right to buy all these corporate bonds and ETFs, all these other monetary tools, because they can't go anywhere with the treasuries anymore.
Yeah, that's the thing. They were not by the charter and mandate of the Federal Reserve. They can't buy anything except treasuries. They're just there to regulate the money supply. But they are at this point buying everything except stocks, basically.
Do the ETFs not have stocks in them?
The ETFs are not themselves stocks, so they can buy the ETFs, but they can't buy the stock.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm not sure the technicalities, but
well, an ETF is like a basket of, for example, an index, but there's still an in between. So the thing is, the Fed can't buy stocks because that would be the government owning corporations. It would be a direct ownership of government of the means of production. And that's kind of an ideologically in the US not acceptable. And it really is, if that would happen, you would really go towards communism, where the state is a major shareholder in corporations, and you don't want that. So they can't buy stocks, but they can buy ETFs, because the ETFs aren't technically stocks, even though the people who have the ETF do own stocks.
I mean, yeah, there's a lack of central bank monetary tools now. The interest rates are zero. The treasuries are being bought up to near zero. So now what they're doing, they're buying corporate bonds and ETFs with indexes in there and all sorts. The yield curve's inverted. The bond market is completely
has been for
broken.
over a year.
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, 30-year bonds are something like 1.5% or something.
For the listener, what a yield curve inversion means is that bonds have higher returns the longer they run. So a 1-year bond will have a lower interest on it than a 10-year bond. At least traditionally that was the case. It's logical because you put away your money for a longer time, so you get a better reward for that investment in essence. What a yield curve inversion is, it means that the 1-year bond has a higher interest than the 10-year bond, which is an unhealthy position for bonds to be in because it indicates a liquidity crisis. So one of the things that the Fed's doing with buying up all of these bonds is that they are creating a shortage of bonds for the banks. The banks are very risk averse at the moment, and they're constantly buying up short-term assets so they can remain highly liquid, because they're very afraid, because it's an uncertain position we're in the economy right now. Nobody is going to do structural investments. Everyone's buying short-term bonds. And with the Fed buying up most of the bonds on the market, this raises the prices even higher and means that this yield inversion keeps becoming more skewed.
Yeah, I mean, the bond market is a complete joke. That the sovereign bonds are negative on short-term money. In places like Germany and the safe European countries, we had this Basel III legislation which enforces bond purchases.
It basically forces pension funds and so on into buying bonds, government bonds.
Yeah, I don't have any bonds in my portfolio at all.
Neither.
I mean, what does your portfolio look like at the moment?
At the moment, I have, I think, probably about 70% cash, because I'm just waiting for another market crash. But in terms of invested money, I've got about 30% in silver and gold, and then all the rest in stocks. And some, I guess, like 10% in cryptos. Cryptos are always an interesting one to be speculating in. It's not really a market of value. But I mostly hold stocks, and I hold stocks in companies which I'm sure would survive any recession or economic crash. Chip manufacturers, oil producers, car companies, things that actually produce goods. So no financials, no banks.
Yeah. I sound quite similar to you. Probably less of a gold bug, but I do have about 10% of my stocks in precious metal mines. I've got a ton of utilities, which shouldn't be affected by crisis. I'm about 50% cash as well, because I want to buy into real estate next year after the COVID hits. And then you get the unemployment and the banking liquidity crisis after that. Yeah, I also just invested in an insolvency company this week. So yeah, but the big players. Well, another interesting thing is silver has become a safe haven asset again. It was very much out of favor since about 2011.
Yeah, so there's one thing to explain about silver markets is that people who are into the metals markets, a lot of them believe that silver is being manipulated. It's shorted constantly, and there's some proof of that. Lehman Brothers constantly shorts the silver market. So silver is undervalued, because if you look at the actual amount of silver on the planet versus gold, there's about 20 times the amount of silver as there is gold. So you would expect silver to trend at about 1/20th of the gold price. The thing is, it doesn't. It's at about 100th of the gold price most of the time, which means
it's to 70 now. I think the ratio.
Yeah. Okay. So it's pretty off. And a lot of people expect the price to eventually rise. But the reason I think that a lot of people, that the silver market gets shorted so much, is because it's a necessary industrial metal. And if you let the price actually fluctuate to its real value, you can have some issues with electronics and so on. So if you actually look, for example, at the available reserves on the planet, the gold reserves are considerably larger than the silver reserves. Silver reserves are very low at any given point because they're constantly being used in industry.
Yeah. I mean, my biggest mine that I hold is a Mexican silver mine, mainly silver, called Fresnillo. Yeah, I was trading in, I think it was 2011 when silver hit $50, and then it absolutely collapsed. Then it found its low in mid-March at about $11 or $12. And since then, it's been on a bull run. It's made 29. I think it will probably stay around here for a while, but you never know. I mean, maybe 100 is possible.
I think it's important to explain a bit more about the metals market. So everyone's heard about gold. Everyone knows gold is up at the moment, and gold always responds in a crisis by going up. So the thing about gold is, if you compare the purchasing power of an ounce of gold in 1910, 1810, 1610, and now, it's very, very stable. You can buy pretty much the same amount of goods with an ounce of gold that you could in 1910 today. So relative to fiat currency, it's stable against inflation. And that's one of the main reasons people invest in gold. And it's also one of the main reasons why a lot of wealthy people hold gold as an investment. It's also the reason why a lot of investment funds do not buy gold. No structural investors, major banks, anything hold gold, except Lehman's, which holds silver. Because it doesn't pay a dividend, as Warren Buffett famously said, and it's a safe haven. And if your goal is to earn money, which is the purpose of any investment fund is to earn money, you can't really do that with gold because it's just something you put it in safely. What does happen is that the dividends paid out to shareholders, those shareholders then go out to buy gold. And that way they protect their wealth.
Yeah. As much as people like precious metals as a store of value, the real power brokers in the world look for opportunities to make yield. So we're seeing, that play out in tech, especially since the COVID crisis. I mean, we're now at Apple 2 trillion, Amazon 1.65 trillion, Microsoft 1.6 trillion, Tesla 400 billion. To me, these valuations are absolutely crazy. The yields are under 2%. Yeah. And I think they really speak to the power of the American empire to conquer foreign lands with their corporations.
Just go look up traded stocks. Like, for example, there's a Dutch company called, well, it's a broker, but they publish the most traded stocks in Europe every month. It's always Tesla, Apple at the top, always.
I think as nationalists, it's absolutely essential for us to understand the way the American system is built, the way the corporations are given these advantages to go around the world and take over global markets.
Yeah,
that's something that I was quite naive about as a junior investor. I didn't realize the power that America had in the world. As an Englishman, I've always been skeptical of America, and I generally invested in our own markets. From a financial perspective, I wish I'd had the sort of view of the world that I have now, and been able to sort of put my money in dollars 10 years ago and ride the wave of American empire expansion, because their tech industry and the power of Silicon Valley is incredible. It's incredibly scary. It affects our culture monumentally. And it's something, as nationalists, we need to be united against.
Well, out of a point of principle, I only invest in Dutch companies and some German ones, but no US.
Yeah, I mean, I actually voted for Brexit while holding over 90% of my portfolio in sterling.
I made about 500 euros just betting on Brexit happening. So what I did is I shorted pounds and I held stock.
Yeah, I mean, I lost about 20% of my net worth on the international market over the Brexit vote. I believed in it at the time. I believe in it less so now because I see the manipulation and the intent behind it by some. But I think, I'm still net in favour of it because it sends a strong signal that the European people are not in favour of demographic replacement and neoliberal economics. We need something sustaining, that protects our culture, because we are human beings, not just consumption units. And, we don't believe in all this equality nonsense and all the things that these liberals in control of the system do.
Well, I think Brexit's good because it sets you apart. And I really want, your bunch of islands out of our beautiful German ruled system that we're building here, because you're just going to cause interference.
I mean, I do respect the Germanic way of doing things a lot, and I think in terms of European, if there were a European super state, a blend of Germanic influence and Anglo influence could be a good thing. I think the Meds are the biggest problem when it comes to financial management because they like to sit around in the sun more than the Nords. That's how I envisage it. I think most of the innovation from European civilization has come from the Nords, and leadership will naturally gravitate towards that region.
Yeah, I think at this point it's because you're talking about North and South differences, it's probably important to explain why the euro doesn't really work and how central banking works. So the big central banks, of course, are the U.S. Federal Bureau, the Fed, and in Europe we have the ECB, the European Central Bank, which is made up. So how central banks work is the board of leadership is made up of banks. The biggest banks in a country make up the board. So in the US, it's the biggest banks are on the board of the Fed. I think it's 13 banks. In Europe, it's the central banks of each country that are on the board of the European Central Bank. This also means that the policies made by central banks are always going to be in favor of financials, which we could clearly see with how money was spent during the printing press hysteria during COVID. It went massively to stocks, not much to unemployment relief, not much to actually shoring up the economy itself by investing in productive materials. So there's a conflict of interest there. Then what the mandate is of central banks is to regulate the money supply. They are in charge of the fiat currency of the country. In Europe, it's euro, US dollar, of course. US dollar has aspects to it that don't apply to the EU because it is a global empire, and it's the dollar is as much a weapon as the American aircraft carriers are. It's currency manipulation and so on make sure that the US has a favorable position in trade, for example. We do similar things in Europe, but one of the big problems we have with the euro is the big differences between the economies. So one of the reasons we have zero interest rate is because if we didn't, the southern countries would collapse under their debt. During the 50s, 60s, 70s, one of the main ways the Italians and Greeks managed to stabilize their economy was just defaulting. Defaulting, going negative on their rates, or just adding another zero to their currency. They can't do that with the euro anymore, and no northern country would consent to that because it would wipe away their savings. In the Netherlands, for example, we have 2 trillion euros in assets in our pension funds, which are being slowly eaten away by the low inflation rate, meaning inflation is important because inflation is return on investment. And if you don't get a return on investment, why would you invest? At the same time, it's good for the debtor to have low interest. It's bad for the creditor to have low interest. So we're kind of in this impasse where in the north we have a lot of assets and reserves. In the south they have a lot of debt. And we have one currency to make do. You have anything to add there?
No disagreement so far. I was just going to add that it's always a Goldman Sachs banker in control of the Fed and the ECB, or more often than not, anyway.
In the case of the ECB, it's usually Italians. They don't put they always put Southerners on there.
Well, I was trading when the Frenchman Trichet was running the show. He actually ended up raising interest rates in 2011 when the EU had a serious liquidity crisis. And when he made the sort of second or third interest rate rise, I think basically the entire financial system started buying bonds because they realized it couldn't last, and there would need to be QE later down the line.
Yeah. So that's maybe a good important one to explain. So how do central banks regulate the money supply? They issue currency. How do they do that? By how do they put it into the market? They buy treasuries, so they buy government debt, and they give newly printed dollars to the government. They can't buy directly from the government for some strange reason, but that's the law. So what they do is the government issues debt, normal financial institutions like investment funds and banks buy them, and then they sell them over to the Fed. And then the Fed pays them to the normal banks, and that's how the money goes into the system. The theory of QE was that they would just buy a lot of government debt, put all this newly printed money into the market, and that would trickle down and be invested into real productive labor. The thing is, if you want to, the growth has been negative, even expressed in GDP. And one important thing to note about GDP is that it's expressed in fiat. But if you want to see if an economy actually increases its productivity, you want to look at its energy consumption. Anyway, all that money that's been printed since 2012 has been stuck in the markets. It's not going into the real economy. There's trillions and trillions on the balance sheets of banks and investment funds, but none of it is going into the real economy. That is also the only reason why there hasn't been massive inflation, because we have printed, the US Fed printed $21 trillion before the COVID crisis, and they printed another $7 trillion this time. So now there's $28 trillion, but they're not in circulation. If they were in circulation, you'd notice it. You'd notice inflation by supermarket prices going up and so on. That hasn't happened. This means that there's a giant bubble created by this printed money on the financial markets, and it's going to collapse at some point, but if they can keep plugging it by printing more money, that's what they're going to do.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned earlier sort of how it is communistic. And yeah, it is a great irony that it's sort of turned into this communistic structure, what we're living under now. We've got total ownership of the means of production by an elite. We've got these commissars managing it. And there's despair for the people. They don't have a religion, and they're just sort of the proletariat that get fed this atheistic, degenerate lifestyle to keep control of them.
Yeah, and so the thing is, the central banking policy of printing money is exclusively beneficial to the elites. It makes sure their assets don't depreciate. It makes sure that they earn, because if the money goes into the market, the stock prices go up, which means one thing, for example, that happened a lot is asset buybacks, stock buybacks by big corporations, which means the value goes up. So it's all protection of the elites. And there is still inflation, right? There is inflation. It's less than it could be if all of this money went into the real economy, but there is still inflation. And inflation is always pillaging of the working classes and the middle classes because their labor is worth less. If you were to be paid in something that's proof against inflation, so not fiat, it would be better for you because you could your purchasing power would stay the same. The thing is, your purchasing power every year decreases because your wages generally don't increase to the same level as inflation, and you hold most of your money, you hold it in cash. Most people do anyway, and you're paid in cash. So in that sense, it's pillaging you, and at the same time, it's all government debt. All of it is, in the end, government debt. And who pays for that? You, through taxation. So any money that's used to pay interest on bonds, to pay the sovereign on bonds, that's all your taxes going there. And we increase taxes constantly. There's all these hidden taxes. Like you have your income tax, which, by the way, didn't exist until 1914-15 in most countries because it was used to pay for the First World War. There's a lot of
property tax, fuel tax,
exactly,
tobacco tax.
There's so many taxes that are all in the end used to prop up this system. And there's not just taxes, there's also mandatory insurance, mandatory pension funds. And I have this theory about pension funds and mandatory insurance being also just, well, there is a logic there, right? Some people are irresponsible and they don't save for their old age. I just don't believe that's a significant enough number that it would warrant this sort of pension structure where you mandatorily pay into it. Then there's also the issue that pension funds in most countries don't have enough return on investment because they have very poor management and they have all these laws that other investment companies and banks don't have. So their hands are very tied in what kind of asset classes they can buy, which means that you never really get the amount of money you pay into the system. You hardly get really much of it back. If you were to invest yourself, you'd have a better old age pension fund. So my theory about a lot of this mandatory insurance and mandatory pension fund is that it's a way to make sure that there's a cash flow into financial markets. It makes sure that there's sort of a bottom line where these institutions like pension funds exist to prop up the stock market. Because if they didn't, then it would be just banks and private investors, which is a lot less stable. So pension funds kind of build a stability into the stock market, which can then be pillaged by banks and so on.
Yeah, one thing that people forget about money printing as well is that the people it is granted to get to use it first. They're the people that buy the market at the absolute bottom.
Yeah.
And then, some of it, some of the value may trickle down, but, the proles at the end of the line get next to no value compared to the elites that got to buy all these asset classes at the absolute bottom. And it is a grave injustice. The esoteric nature of understanding the financial system. It is so convoluted, confusing to the common man that he has absolutely no
Exactly.
chance.
I mean, what person that you speak on the street understands inflation or understand asset classes really? If I tell, most of my friends are educated on finance, but if I just speak to people at work, for example, and explain to them that they shouldn't really save in fiat, they should save in gold bonds or something else, they just say you're crazy, then I can't buy. They don't understand why their money devalues.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the dissident right is a case in point. Very intelligent people on the whole probably have an average IQ of something near 120 for the sort of influences involved in the riot. But yet we're sort of making this podcast about finance and how it functions because we feel it is a massively lacking discussion within the community. So if only a handful of us out of a very talented pool of people understand it, then there's so little hope for the common man to understand it. And sort of going back to it demonstrates sort of the failure of conservatism and sort of how they frame their politics and it's sort of being a social order based on Christianity, and then we have this distributed wealth among the population, according with property rights and market competition and hard work. If you work hard, you'll succeed, and all these kind of platitudes. But it's not a reality. There's no regulation of competition, and we get these massive monopolies. They're intertwined with the central banking monopolies. And most of it is situated in the United States, backed up by the US military, and the constant threat of massive sanctions against non-compliant nations. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and the IMF also plays a role in there and making them debt slaves. Well, there's Marx is of course we are all anti-Marxist. The thing is, Marx had bad solutions but some good analysis. So one of the things he said was labor creates all value, and capital accrues value quicker than labor. And that's true. It's visible. You do not make money the same way through your salary, through working, as you do if you just go investing. You'll make money a lot quicker by investing, unless you're very incompetent at it. If you even if you just buy stocks and let them accrue dividend, and you let that passive capital generate itself, and you have enough starting capital, you'll get way richer than just working hard. And that's kind of a problem because this is how you can get into usury. Labor does produce all value. Steel is worthless if it isn't transformed into something. There is no steel if someone doesn't produce it. Raw materials mean nothing. Services don't exist without someone putting in work. Work transforms valueless things into valuable things. Sure, markets then determine the price because of shortages or excesses, but the actual product is still made by someone's labor. So they get relatively little reward for actually making the good, one of the big, and that's why central banks really are immoral, because they promote this system of usury, of parasitism upon others' labor, by creating inflation, by propping up stock markets, by making sure elites hold their financial power. And we really should go and back and reevaluate some of what Marx had to say about economics in that sense. His conclusions about how to solve it were pretty dumb, but his analysis is pretty good.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Marx understood the nature of capitalism and made some good critiques. You know, as Europeans, we would aim for something a lot higher than his solutions. You know, something based in a shared destiny according to our history and race, and some spirituality to go along with that.
Well, that's actually maybe a good one to go into automatization, because considering labor is so important, we're kind of moving towards a future where a lot of mechanical labor is going to be done by machines.
Yeah, I mean, we've discussed this before on TASOB. I'm very bearish on the prospect of the utility of human labor in the not too distant future. I don't think tech unemployment is being spoken about nearly enough. I think that the greed involved in the financial system and the lack of planning in democratic politics and the general nihilism of the power brokers in society will result in a collapse of the financial system in the West in about 20 to 30 years. You know,
I'd call that a positive outcome, to be honest.
You think it will collapse sooner than that?
No, I think if it would collapse, that would be a positive outcome, because it would delay the technostopia we're heading towards. I actually think it's kind of optimistic to say it will collapse.
I mean, it depends on how brainwashed the people are into continuing buying into the structure that exists at that time. Because, you know, people like us understand the system to be so corrupt that, you know, we're putting huge amounts of our capital into precious metals and safe haven assets, because, you know, we don't see it continuing long into the future. But the average man, he's sort of addicted to his material comforts and buying into the garbage that's fed to him, like Netflix.
And he doesn't have savings. Like, I think less than 5% of the US population has more than $1,000 in savings. The Netherlands has considerably more savings, but I think it's only about 30% of the population here that has more than 2,000 euros in savings.
Yeah, even middle-class people are very wage packet to wage packet. They live in expensive apartments in cities. You know, they have some administrative job in a Globo Homo corporation, and they go out and spend money on, you know, cocktails and expensive meals, and don't have children. That kind of lifestyle is ever increasing. I mean, we have 2-bed apartments, or 1-bed apartments being built everywhere in the UK.
Yeah,
you
it's
know,
funny.
It's almost as if the government is aware of the social decline of our civilization and is accommodating that in the financial system.
It's funny because we have this hardline Christian party here in the Netherlands, and what they constantly say about the housing crisis is that it's not necessarily just immigration that causes it, but also the fact that there is considerably more divorce and considerably less marriages than in the past. So a lot of households are now one person instead of two. So housing crisis, yeah, one of those things. Automatization, well, you know, people probably have gotten depressive enough over me talking about automatization all the time, but it is a very serious issue. In future, it's looking like only mental labor is really going to be around. And there we can go into Marx again, the alienation that people experience from their labor. Mental labor is very alienating. You don't produce anything physical, you don't see what you produce. And even if it does create value, it's still very abstract. So it doesn't make you happy. Mental labor isn't really good for human happiness.
I do think it does make women happy in some way. These sort of mid-wit women that occupy these administrative positions in the sort of tertiary industrial sectors, they do seem fulfilled and empowered by their jobs to some degree, particularly in their 20s and early 30s before the infertility question kicks in.
I don't know. Are they? They all seem to be addicted to, I don't know, wine, social media, and cats. It doesn't really seem to.
They don't really get to the wine and cat stage until they're a bit older. I think the sort of emergent graduate seems to feel very empowered by the sort of privilege that this society grants them. I've noticed that in many middle-class women. One of my friends, very intelligent girl, she just got a job at Goldman Sachs, and she's absolutely over the moon about it. And I've seen many, beautiful and talented girls that have this attitude, and I was just sort of say to them, there's more to life than working in these jobs. But they seem very eager to get their first pay packet and get their first decent car and nice apartment and things like this.
Interesting. I haven't really experienced that, but isn't it maybe possible that it's because they've been indoctrinated that should be their goal their whole life, that fulfilling that just gives them the idea of happiness?
I just think it's people in general, godless people are just, controlled by material instincts. I probably notice it more with women because my own friendship group don't really care too much for material. I mean, I have quite an intelligent friendship group from school, and financially, most of them would be, not motivated by money at all, really. But it's quite a different story among other sort of groups of friends that I have that are very much consumed by sort of climbing the ladder of financial progression and all this kind of thing. So people I experience at arm's length that leads me to that conclusion. Maybe it affects men and women the same, I'm not sure. But yeah, going back to the housing sector that you mentioned, I mean, as far as I can tell, that's one of the only true industries of growth in the West.
Yeah, because all these immigrants.
Yeah, it's the immigration, it's the divided families, and it's these construction companies paying the political parties to have the right to tarmac over our beautiful land.
Yeah, with really ugly buildings as well.
Yeah, there are some peculiar buildings, certainly, all over the UK, the cities everywhere. It's just 1 and 2 bedroom apartment blocks going up absolutely everywhere, cranes everywhere. And if you look at the Conservative Party donors list, it's a hell of a lot of construction companies. Even Chinese ones are.
If you want to make money, just go work in construction without an allocation. Just start a construction company, go work in construction because you're assured of employment.
Yeah. I mean, Germany has had flatlining house prices for many years, have they not? From the sheer volume of houses they're building for the replacement population.
Yeah, I believe so. In the Netherlands, of course, we have a huge housing shortage because not only do we take in a lot of immigration, we're also the most densely packed country in Europe. So we don't have a lot of space to keep building. And building in the Netherlands is expensive because it's marsh. So you need to build very, very solid foundations, which you don't have to do in other countries.
I mean, how do you see the sort of tech unemployment playing out? I think we'll start off losing sort of shop assistants,
cashiers,
taxi drivers,
truck drivers,
truck drivers. They're all going to go. They're going to be just living off welfare and declining socially, getting addicted to opiates and whatever.
Yeah, and I think that if the current system is allowed to go on, that's just what they'll just allow them to die off through misery slowly, I guess.
Yeah, I mean that's exactly what's happening in the US already. Trump gave them about 2 weeks of pension when he was posturing his nationalist agenda, but that all got covered up. He was talking about the opioid crisis and sort of the abuse of big pharma, never spoken of again since early 2017 or something. But this is the thing. Going back to the sort of the central banking and the sort of debt that's being issued, people are being issued 30-year mortgages, and they're not going to have jobs in probably 10 years.
True.
And I just think that there's all this university debt. There's $2 trillion of university debt in the US. people that are literally studying, some form of bastardized communism, and all the, critical race theory and
there's a lot of people who are going to have to move back with their parents.
Oh yeah, an awful lot. So I think we're going to get a massive debt crisis, 2008 times 10, when the jobs start going, and then I think there'll be.
There's one thing to note about mortgages is the problem in 2008 was the defaults. Now you'll probably have defaults this time as well, but one of the changes they've made in the system is that no bank holds mortgages anymore. Not directly. The actual holders of mortgages are the Fed. The Fed holds them all on the balance sheet. So what they do is, you go to a bank in the US, you ask for a mortgage, you buy a house, you get the mortgage, and the mortgage is immediately flipped by your bank to the Fed, because they don't want to hold that. They don't want to hold anything that can be risky. And this is a new thing. This has been happening for the last 2 years or so. Because of some new legislation they introduced that allowed this, but basically all the houses in the US are at this point owned by the Federal Reserve.
So yeah, it's more communism, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because if you get defaults, then effectively the state will.
Well, yeah, but that's kind of the thing.
The real estate.
That's what's going to be tested if large-scale defaults happen. Who is the owner then? The Fed can't really own houses. They can't really sell houses. Does the state own them?
I think we could well see a collapse of the system whereby the financial elites claim ownership to be the new technocrats and commissars of the new communism. And they will have, a drone army, possibly, a Facebook drone army to enforce their power. And, that could be the future we're facing. And coming together as a folk, we need to be organized to take advantage of a collapse, and we need to start building the institutions and brotherhood to be able to take back power when it does all fall down.
I think it's important to note that we don't have that much time. Like the clock's already ticking because of demographic replacement, but I think the clock is ticking even faster because of this idea of centralized control. Censorship is more insidious than just not allowing you to speak. It's about control of the message. It's about brainwashing the general population. Controlling the message is a very important thing for governments and so on to do. Secondly, if you can replace, soldiers can be disloyal. Even if you indoctrinate and program them, there's still a risk that they might, be disloyal, especially a risk with higher officers. So, if the military can be replaced by things like drones and so on, and you can put, the UK is a big fan of security cameras. Well, if you can make security cameras and, link them up to self-driving drones and so on, well, that eliminates the disloyalty component in the military as well.
It's it's not just techno surveillance capitalism, which everyone is subjected to with the adverts on their phone apps and their smartphones, and sort of the tracking of the smartphones in your location that will result in more advertising coming your way. And as you say, the UK is lining up facial recognition cameras, and that will all integrate with the brainwashing capitalist system. It's it's the NSA as well. It's the CIA and the security services being able to hear what any dissident is saying through a smart device, what any dissident is speaking about over the internet. They can deplatform you, they can deperson you, they can ruin your life, they can strike absolute fear into the population. And even if the population, 80% of the population is uneasy with the system as it exists, they care more about their safety and material comfort.
Yeah, short-term security.
According to their life, more than they care about the collective, which is a situation we're now in because most
even
people
from a
don't
selfish perspective, it's short-term reasoning because you don't do anything about it now. You're going to be beaten up in an elderly home by a diversity hire. You're going to be stripped of your pension funds because of usurious central banking. Not speaking up is a very short-term safety thing, but long-term disastrous even for yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. We can analyze it like that, but people do generally function according to the short term. So many people only care about the next 7 days, particularly particularly the racial replacement coming to our lands that have a much lower time preference than us. I mean, I've always been in the habit of planning in many ways into the years and decades into the future. So yeah.
To get back to low IQ and tech replacement, not to sound too uncompassionate, but the thing is that low IQ people do not have a future, and you're not going to be able to really stop technology marching onward. So even if we had a really based nationalist system, you're going to have to find some way to deal with the fact that at some point anyone under 100 IQ is useless, and that curve keeps increasing. And then there are some solutions, like you can go for a sort of communist system where you go for UBI and everyone just gets a subsistence level handout from the government, which funds itself by taxing all these automized, these huge companies who hold control to all the automatization. That doesn't really seem like a very good solution to me. I don't ideologically have a problem with UBI because of it makes you lazy or whatever. It's just not really a long-term solution, and it's productivity that's just keeping people alive for not really any purpose. I think you really have to start considering eugenics and so on, and making sure that just people who are lower IQ they're not allowed to breed, I'm afraid.
I think there is, UBI is the only solution long term. It's just a question of how we order our society and what we reward for people doing in society. Are we going to grant more breeding rights to the sportsmen and the artists and the skilled technocrats and people involved in culture and things like that, military leaders perhaps?
Well, you have to,
because I mean that's how it should be structured. That I believe the best couple should be having 8 children and the,
but how do you make
sure
of that? You need to do that through financial stimulus, through cultural stimulus. It's not a culture we live in now.
Just, I would say state enforcement.
State enforcement is usually a less efficient solution than incentives.
Yeah, and but the people are manipulated through the media. The incentives are according to what people believe is correct. I'm massively in favour of media manipulation of the populace and
it's always going to happen.
creating a culture of excellence that way, and bringing everyone on board to compete.
So you kind of go with Plato's Republic idea of philosopher kings and the golden men who steer society through unaware means.
Yeah, certainly something like that. It worked very well in Germany last century. That's the way I see it. Not just a eugenics according to IQ, because then you just become a merchant race. It needs to be based on something more.
I'm afraid that the old tripartite system that we ordered society by is gone, dead, gone, buried, and not coming back. I'm afraid the working class...
I think it could come back. Well, after collapse, there's any number of ways we could rebuild.
Right, but we still have automatization, which makes the worker unnecessary, which makes the soldier unnecessary, leaving only the priest.
Yeah, and the priest caste will have a massive part in that. I still think there would be a space for soldiers, because there are still going to be other civilizations. I mean, I've been working as a merchant class for my entire adult life, and I've developed more spirit in the last 3 years for higher ideals than I ever have before now. So I certainly believe in the potential for people to rebuild themselves to
people themselves can.
But
how do you order society around the traditional tripartite idea, when the big roles for a lot of the people in that sort of model of society are gone? If the best proxy I could find for soldiers is engineers and space explorers and maybe people who go colonize other planets. But for the workers, it's gone, and you're never going to have a need of so many soldiers either. So,
What about just occupying Africa or Middle East as an
but that's
empire?
pretty short terms, right? That's conquer, deal with it, and then.
I mean, sportsmen. I've as an Englishman, I've always been a huge fan of sports. I think it's a brilliant proxy for military conflict.
Well, increasingly,
and I think that would.
That's kind of increasingly that's sort of the role people are going to have. What's your job? YouTube streamer. What's your job? Athlete. Those are entertainment is probably the only sector that's near impossible to replace with technology. Although, I mean, is gaming technology, right? That sort of thing. So if you've got self-programming games, there's not really any jobs in that. The thing is that it doesn't really solve the problem, I think.
I think we will ultimately get to such a level of efficient allocation by technology that the only necessary jobs will be something like technocrats to administer the system in not very big numbers and protect the system from other civilizations. You'll have a priest class to protect the sort of spiritual interests of the society and make sure it doesn't become bourgeoisie interlopers or whatever. Then at a community level, you will have various people involved in, maybe some form of agriculture or, community activities like sport and art. And, I'm not saying competitive agriculture, but just being,
for fun.
Local production for fun, sports, things like this. Community activities are theatre.
That still is not really a solution for the lower IQ people and even for a lot of other people, work gives people a meaning and structure in life, and making your own meaning, filling your own day with meaningful things, that's pretty hard, even for quite smart people.
Do you think that's related to high IQ, mate, of giving yourself meaning?
I think higher IQ people are a lot better at it. I think higher IQ people, I've always seen this correlation that higher IQ people tend to also be more active, have more interests and hobbies, and lower IQ people tend to resort quicker to substance abuse, for example, to deal with boredom.
Yeah, you could be right about that. I haven't really analysed the numbers. I mean, high IQ people also suffer from, serious nihilism and not really believing that there's anything worth living for. So I don't know. I think there could be a space for lower IQ people as, exceptional athletes and exceptional musicians and artists and
speaking of
actors
athletes,
and things like
this is a little funny anecdote. Who do you think are the highest taxed people in the world? Not bankers, it's athletes.
I think you mentioned it before, the footballers.
Yeah, exactly. The people who pay the most taxes relative are professional athletes. Why? Because all of their income is in the form of salaries and prizes, which is taxed at a much higher rate than capital dividends are. A footballer pays more taxes than a banker, which is another example of how this system really does reward capital and capitalists more than it rewards labor and actual work.
Have you ever looked at the Panama Papers? And the sort
there
of
are
people
so many. I've looked
at
some, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's names you can imagine with sort of business endeavours that wouldn't surprise you on the front page. It's quite amusing, a lot of theft of government resources and such. But yeah, do we have any conclusions to draw of?
I think we both
agree that.
I think the conclusion we can draw is that we need to go to a healthier financial system, and that would involve just breaking central banks. No more central banks. Go back to more things like credit unions and co-ops for allocating capital, because allowing the centralization of financial means is just a bad idea. If you want to have a unstable monetary supply such as fiat and not go back to something like gold, then make the state be the issuer of it directly and don't let other interests control it. And I think from a more libertarian perspective, because I've been quoting Marx here, but I should also give a more libertarian take, Frédéric Bastiat, who was a French economist from the mid-19th century, He used the analogy that as soon as the state starts giving out subsidies, the entirety of society becomes about the pursuit of these subsidies. Every class, every company, every interest group, every ethnic group, every religious group will be competing against each other for subsidies from the state, and the state will become nothing but a giant feeding trough. So state subsidies and institutions like pension funds and mandatory insurance are a huge risk for this sort of thing being carried on into perpetuity.
Yeah, I do like a lot of Bastiat's stuff. I think the state is inevitable, though, due to tech. It's just a question of whether we as a European people can take back control of it from these treacherous elites. I think it's going to look something like I've just described, some sort of techno-feudalism or techno-communism without the social subversions. We need something cultural, something eugenic, something that can involve all our nations to bring the greatest richness possible to it. In terms of the monetary system, I'm not really that interested in reform, because I think this system's so corrupt and it's going to continue down its path until it collapses. I'm not going to moan about it anymore. I'm just going to.
But you're still going to have to build alternatives once it collapses.
Yeah, for sure. But for the meantime, I'm just investing in protecting my capital and sort of encouraging nationalists to get away from the main system, build your own communities, build something meaningful in your own lives, have children, train your children up to have will to power, to take control of, our birthright after the main system collapses. And we should aggravate the collapse in any way that we can until then.
I think one of the conclusions that we can also take away is that there should be more valuation of labor, and the people who profit from our society should be those who work and who have intellect, who put intelligence and labor forward, and not people who, through capital inherited or otherwise gained, basically profit off the system without putting anything into it. It's important to note that real value is only created by demand and by work, and that anything that doesn't really improve society, build something, invests in it, and just profits someone is parasitic upon the society. So a lot of banking and so on, and a lot of these people are just basically parasitic upon society because they survive on it, they profit off it, and they don't put anything back into it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that another Marxian analysis would be sort of Adorno and Horkheimer on the culture industry and the collapse of culture that we get from this capitalist system. It just pumps out worse and worse culture for the masses, and the standards get lower every year. And we should be aiming for something that doesn't monetize every facet of art, and we aim for high art again, and we create a society that rewards the artists. So that's my dream. I think we're in general agreement on that, and hopefully the audience has got some value from this analysis.
Yeah, I think takeaway for the audience: go read a bit about how the monetary system in the Fed works. It's important to know.
Das ist unser Land. Ein Land des Friedens und der Fülle. Ein Land voll Harmonie und Hoffnung. Das sind unsere Menschen. Die Arbeiter, die Vorwärtsstrebenden, die Erbauer. Das ist unser Volk. Die Erbauer unserer Welt. Gedankenpolizei. Selbsterniedrigungen. Glauben Sie mir, alles andere werden wir vernichten. Glauben Sie mir, Wir vernichten. Gedankenpolizei.